Well, I think the important takeaway is to acknowledge that the Great Awakening all around the world is teaching us to not trust those in power, period. And as much as I admire President Trump, I have to maintain a healthy degree of skepticism always because that's how we guard against being overthrown in our hearts and in our minds.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to the Black Swan Capitalist YouTube channel. Today, I have a very special guest, SG Anon. A lot of you guys asked me to bring him on, and of course, his identity stays anonymous for good reason, I'm sure. SG, it's a pleasure to have you. Thank you for taking the time to be here with me today.
Well, thank you for having me on, Versan. I'm honored.
I've been watching your show for a year now. I told you this. Some very good friends of mine in this space certainly recommended you. And I've been listening to the way you speak, and you just have a really great way of breaking things down methodically. And of course, telling people what's going on behind the scenes. A lot of the stuff we hear is really mainstream propaganda. And I guess my first question is with Trump being reelected, despite a lot of the mainstream narrative, we see him placing some very interesting figures in his cabinet. And I just want to get your perspective. Why do you think he's choosing these elitists, contradicting what he's been saying and his stance against the deep state?
Well, you're no doubt referring to some of the individuals that are, I think we could say at the very least are subject to potential co-opting with foreign states. One of those states, of course, being the Israeli state. There is a irregular warfare landscape that's playing out and has been playing out over these last many years. And one of the things that we noticed in the first Trump administration that I want to sort of pivot the discussion off of was the Abraham Accords itself. When I saw the picture of Trump and Netanyahu after signing the Abraham Accords, Netanyahu did not seem very pleased at all. As a matter of fact, he had quite the frown on his face. And that tells me that something about that meeting or something about that particular agreement may not have been in the service of whatever agenda was behind the Netanyahu government. It's very interesting, Rassam, when we talk about Netanyahu, that the man's bloodline actually ties more back to Central and Eastern Europe rather than the Levant area, which is, of course, modern day Lebanon, Israel, Syria, those types of things. And so pivoting off of that and understanding that that was the underpinning for a lot of the military action that we've seen happening in the Middle East over the last 2 to 3 years, I'm reluctant to cast too much doubt on Trump at this point, but I have to publicly acknowledge that this is very suspect. And so I think one of the things that I'm doing right now, fundamentally is I'm trying to withhold my judgment, but I'm not against publicly questioning the efficacy of some things. I'm looking into the backgrounds of individuals. One of them is Zeldin. There's another one in the form of the new ambassador to Israel and others. And I'm just trying to understand in that research if we have any good irregular warfare conclusions that make logical sense that would lead to a broader exposure, a dragging out of the Mossad intelligence community, of the IRGC, U.S. State Department cross-infiltration problem that we have. And I think in some regards, we could see some of that. However, I have to also acknowledge that my head is a bit on a swivel here as we go through this cabinet appointment period for this next Trump administration, because publicly, these are going to be the important individuals to keep an eye on. And their policy statements and their policy positions are also going to be very important to keep an eye on and will directly drive whatever geopolitics are happening, not only in the Middle East, but around the world.
Very interesting. If I could be frank with the audience and you, my brother and I, we are very careful when we speak about these things because there's just so much that's really going on behind the scenes. And my brother and I come to the same conclusion that we're seeing, the same dragon, if you will, on both sides of the coin. Now, he could be also saying things and doing things to please other individuals, maybe. And that's what I'm already hearing from some of my sources on the back end. But I really think that history in some way, form, or fashion is repeating itself. A lot of these operations, and I don't want this to get taken down from YouTube, and I'm going to certainly put this on Rumble. But when you look at like Hamas, for instance, or some of these rogue operations, these are no doubt manufactured products. If you know what I'm trying to say here, I got to be very careful. But this all is very similar to what we saw, what happened with Iraq, trying to invade foreign countries under false pretenses. But there's a lot of doubt that is coming from the other side, the people who voted Trump in office. So I'm just, curious. It's crazy to think, like, are we right back where we started? Have we been baited? Just final thoughts on that before we move on to the next question. We can start talking about the economy and so forth.
Well, I think the important takeaway is to acknowledge that the Great Awakening all around the world is teaching us to not trust those in power, period. And as much as I admire President Trump, I have to maintain a healthy degree of skepticism always, because that's how we guard against being overthrown in the mind, right? In our hearts and in our minds. And so I would submit to your audience out there that, of course, the possibility does exist. I think we have to acknowledge that the events to come over the next 2 to 4 months are probably going to showcase out and really flesh out, obviously, where this is going. And if need be, we can come back to that digital army online, exposing the truth, putting geopolitical pressure where they need to be, driving the importance of the actual truth, the actual conditions, the actual situations that are occurring within these geopolitical spaces, such as in the Middle East. And I think in so doing that, Versan, we can actually avoid or negate a great deal of the problems that you highlighted a moment ago, even if we are dealing with a dragon on two sides of the coin.
Well, thank you for that. And if, I encourage my audience to go listen to an interview that was released yesterday by Piers Morgan. There's one interesting individual, I don't want to say his name, but I think that was probably one of the most important interviews I've heard in an entire year. Okay, so let's move forward. And this is a financial channel. It's always been. It's just, finance and politics and geopolitics kind of tie in together, kind of tells us where the whole world is going, the economy. So if you can give us an update on the state of the US debt-based system, it really looks like the corporate entity of the United States government is facing bankruptcy. Historically, when governments start losing control, they tend to become more authoritarian. So are we witnessing that now? And if so, what does this mean for America and Americans every day?
Well, I think you hit the nail, quite frankly, on the head there. We are witnessing this exact pattern playing itself out. It is the age-old story of human history in many regards, and we know a lot of our history has, of course, been co-opted by this very dark group of individuals that has had control of Western world finance for at least the last 1,000 years. And that's one of the reasons I think that we have to look at the death of the U.S. fiat dollar and the U.S. Federal Reserve System as necessary in this process, no matter what. We have to remove the central banking empire from the rest of the planet. We have to return sovereignty and the ability to self-direct and self-determine to all nation states that desire it. And we have to allow for the proper management and the proper backing of free and fair trade in the world, of free and fair exchange. We know that serpent dollar system, just for your audience out there, has a history going back approximately 100 years in its current form, really more than 300 years when we look at the longitudinal tiebacks to Central Europe, all of the financial powers that tied back to bloodline families coming out of the Vatican and the Neapolitan age. But looking at what we have right now, we have a strategic maneuver through a number of different countries around the world, both through military pressure, geopolitical pressure, as well as financial and economic actions that are all working in tandem to destroy that very serpent system. Russia just recently, within the last few weeks, established a strategic silver reserve. That establishment is going to essentially evaporate all of the remaining raw silver supply around the world. And at the point that the mining operations can no longer ship the quantity of silver and the supply of silver to the Western world nations so as to support that NATO warlord industrial complex, I think you're also going to see a similar style pressure put against those very same transnational banks that have been manipulating those markets for that purpose. So with Russia's actions and with China's actions over the last 3 to 4 months, as well as the constant dumping of U.S. Treasury bonds all around the world, the Japanese market is continuing to dump those bonds. The Japanese pension fund, quite frankly, is in trouble at this point in the game. I think that what we have sort of on our doorstep, Versan, is the international dissolution of very large U.S.-based financial institutions such as Bank of America and J.P. Morgan. Bank of America has $800 billion just in that particular bank alone in derivative shorts against the silver markets worldwide. If Russia and China, India, and others are able to outmaneuver those shorts and essentially maintain the high value of the COMEX, regardless of what those shorts are applying to the commercial pressure space worldwide, then you're looking at a blowback the likes of which has never been seen. President Trump has talked very recently and has continued to talk up until the election about a 1929 style event. And we know that here in the United States, we're 60 plus days out from President Trump actually having the reins of power. So a tremendous amount of things can happen in this period of time that can be effectively blunted, I think, for the record of future history when we look at the actual dissolution of the U.S. financial landscape. I've said for a while, Versan, that the actions of China and Russia specifically, but China militarily, are going to be very, very important over these next few weeks and months, because those will directly determine how much immediate pressure is put against the underpinnings of the U.S. financial landscape, such as the NASDAQ, which is primarily pinned by the Taiwanese semiconductor industry and the ability of South Korea and Japan to manipulate the commercial debt space of the United States. So looking at that landscape and how the changes that we see happening in the world could apply that sort of multi-angular pressure all at the same time, I think it's completely reasonable to say that an expanded and short-lived period of military conflict in the Pacific is likely to spawn off an irreversible chain of events inside the Western world financial markets that will result fundamentally in their destruction and then in their reimagination.
Reimagination, that's interesting. And I would say that I'm sure you would agree with me. Everything's already in motion. I mean, this is what they're doing. I think they're trying to, keep it outside of the public view still. And that's probably why you see all these headlines. And they're just trying to distract people from what's truly going on beneath the surface of all of this. So this is, I think, where the BRICS nations come in. And going back to a commodity-based system, they're clearly working on bypassing the US dollar, the corrupt infrastructure of the US system, through new blockchain-based technologies, payment systems. And I did send you the document. I don't know if you got a chance to look at it, but my brother and I have certainly uncovered a lot of documents that are widespread adoption of a digital asset, specifically called XRP, which is a cross-border remittance tool. And there's a company behind that called Ripple. Their partnerships with all these institutions seem to be part of a broader plan to build the rails and to move away from the dollar as well. So what's your take on digital assets, specifically XRP, if you had a chance to look at them, and how this ties into the shifting global financial landscape and infrastructure?
Well, I have to say, as I've gone along in this process and tried to educate myself a little bit more about this quantum blockchain landscape that we have sort of burgeoning and emerging around the world, I'm heartily encouraged by a lot of the intercooperative agreements that are happening, and XRP happens to be at the center of a great deal of them. BRICS Pay rolled out just recently, I believe, and we have a website. I believe it's brics-pay.com for those that are in the Western world nations, where you can actually go and reference how the BRICS nations are looking at aligning their financial ledgers and their financial transaction capabilities. And XRP, I think, would have to be, along with other potential, crypto commodities as we go forward, I think that would have to be one of the underpinnings for a cross-border facilitation network. Additionally, I think it's worth highlighting that the SEC here in the United States ruled recently that the XRP cryptocurrency project is not a security. So it's not subject to the same styles of regulations and the same domestic restrictions when we talk about financial transactional capability here. So I think we're looking at the build out, quite frankly, through XRP, maybe as a template, but certainly through the XRP currently, for a cross-border system of minute-to-minute transactional capability that is secured. DLT and blockchain, we know, are going to have to be the way of the future.
Yep.
because those are the only methodologies we're aware of, I think, at this point, or that I'm aware of, Versan, that actually offer true security in the digital landscape. And that's something that is so important moving forward. The ability to money launder, the ability to mask transactions, to shift things around, to essentially misdirect within the financial transaction process itself is how we managed to get the U.S. State Department in 87 countries funding terrorism groups. And some of those groups would come back to the same, relevant geopolitics that we have going on in today's day and time right here, right now. So looking at the reduction and the elimination eventually of the capability to do that, I think is paramount and absolutely crucial if we're going to achieve anything around the idea of free and fair trade in the world. There have been countries in the world that have taken advantage of other countries for hundreds of years, and those other countries have been taken advantage of for 100 years. There's a huge trust, or for hundreds of years. So there's a huge trust gradient and a great deal of distance, I think, to make up, and instilling security and also convenience in that process is one of the main ways I'm viewing the rebuilding of that trust.
Very good point. Yeah. And, for the audience, this is a fact, actually. The technology was originally presented to JP Morgan, Wall Street, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, BlackRock. And when they realized they actually couldn't control what XRP was, what it was doing, they tried to weaponize their influence through tools that they have, like the SEC, Securities Exchange Commission, to pretty much stall Ripple's progress on building these payment rails, these relationships with the banks internationally, especially the BRICS nations, interestingly, who are trying to circumvent the dollar. And what they tried to do was build their own infrastructure through other technologies like Ethereum and Bitcoin. And it's interesting, they can't go after Bitcoin because we don't know who made it. But if you look at the white paper, it actually traces back to the National Security Agency. If I can ask you a very quick question about Bitcoin, what do you think about it?
Well, it's very interesting that you bring that up. When we look at the inauguration of Bitcoin itself, we can actually tie back DARPA projects in the alternative currency space as early as the late 1990s. So looking at the ability of being able to fund essentially completely off book dark criminality and criminal enterprise all around the world, that was really what the inauguration of the cryptocurrency space was all about. And you're absolutely correct. It does tie back to the National Security Administration and the broader intelligence community by extension. Looking at that, landscape and how they built that out, Versan, I think we can make the obvious conclusion that through the 43rd and 44th presidential administrations here in the United States, the end goal was always to desecrate and decimate the physical world economic landscape, the actual commercial landscape that exists kinetically, and provide only a digital option controlled centrally through either CBDCs or some form of cryptocurrency centralized economic ecosystem. And I think that was absolutely the goal. And then we saw the interruption of that plan, I submit to the people out there, in the 2016 election with President Trump. And one of the very first things that he directed the IRS to do was to form a commission to essentially evaluate the feasibility of decentralization at the mass economic landscape. Additionally, over this last 8-year period of time, we do have an act. It's not been passed by the U.S. House of Representatives, but it is on the shelf. I believe it's House Resolution 4367, but don't quote me there. It deals primarily with decentralization of finance. I'd have to go back and look at the actual designation itself. But I put the actual document itself out in an audio file a few weeks ago where I read from it, and it discusses specifically a commission being established by the United States Congress to evaluate what the proper procedure and protocol would need to be to decentralize the financial landscape here in the United States across the 50 states or 50 territories of the Union. So looking at that and seeing how this ties back to that broader centralized cryptocurrency landscape that you brought up just a moment ago, it very much appears that in patriotic terms, if I can put it that way, we're sort of utilizing the enemy's fort and the enemy's infrastructure against them. When we look at the Quantum Act of 2018, similar language is put into place for outlining a new quantum capable financial ecosystem here in the United States of America. So you have a lot of different legislative agendas that all serve the same angle. And I think fundamentally getting the intelligence community out of finance was what some of this was all about.
Very interesting perspective. Just the direction things are going, it looks like quantum computers, artificial intelligence, and blockchain technology are pretty much going to be the gatekeepers to wherever this is all going, to our future. It would seem like the technology has more of a grip on humanity than humanity has the grip on technology. And this is going to tie me into another question. My brother and I, we do very deep research. We don't talk about everything because we can get censored very easily on YouTube. But we've been doing a lot of research into the United Nations and their latest initiatives. So while Trump was becoming president, all eyes were on Trump. Bitcoin started moving up. Everyone was focused on Bitcoin, not realizing that Tether issued 5 billion tokens before Bitcoin went up anyways. The United Nations was putting out some very interesting articles, and I encourage you to go check it out sometime. But it looks like there's a major disconnect again between what they are saying and what they are doing, because many world leaders, like about 3 weeks ago, maybe, were speaking at the UN, and they kept promoting the need for digital IDs. Something that seems very far, in my opinion, from decentralization. It's more about centralized control and surveillance. So I believe it's really tied to a broader agenda that might even fit into the climate change policies that might have ulterior motives. So what is your view on this push for digital IDs and, the United Nations real objective? And we can even bring scripture into this because they talk about a one world government. It's really crazy. It's a real rabbit hole. So what do you think?
It's sort of prophecy fulfilling itself in real time, is it not?
Yeah.
And so when we look at what the United Nations is doing, Versan, and I want to make it clear for your audience out there, when I've gone on my broadcasts and said that patriots within the United States are in control of some key initiatives and some key areas, that by no means means that the war itself is won or that the landscape itself has even been conquered in the background. I think in many regards, the UN is going to be one of the last drag-outs or one of the last major exposés to come to the peoples of the world, because it is the controllers of the UN that have weaponized the entire planet over the last 100 or so years. I think the UN's been in existence for approximately 80 years or so, and we've seen more than 200 conflicts, which the UN itself fomented. So looking at this landscape, I think that you're just seeing the setup, you're seeing the build out, quite frankly, for tyrannical dictatorial power grabs under the ideals of emergency conditions internationally. And what makes that so very interesting, if I can surmise for a moment, is that with the incoming Trump administration, I think it sort of stands to reason that Trump and the American government would not go along with whatever agenda or whatever power grab or authoritarian consolidation grab the UN would attempt to facilitate to the rest of the planet. But at this stage in the game, it's difficult to say. What I think we can say for certain is that the UN will eventually go down as the most hated entity in all of human history for what they've done to the populations of the world, what they did to all of us, the divisions that they sowed, the chaos that they've created. And that drag out process, I think, is going to be nigh at hand as we go into this 2025 post-administration, post-inaugural season.
Wow. A lot to think about. But like you said, it's too early to really speculate. But, I really get concerned because I keep telling people this, even on my private sessions, that it's hard for me to believe that things are going to change unless people change, because governments are really an aggregate of the people. Wouldn't you agree on that? What do we have to do as a population, as a human species, to really come together when we have so much propaganda and you have the left and the right? And I find it very hard to believe that we have to look to somebody like Trump, for instance, to fix our problems instead of us being our own solutions.
I think I would agree with that entirely. And if I may, I believe that's what this Great Awakening, again, is all about. We the people have to realize that it is within our power to effect political and governmental change within our societies. We have a civic duty. We have a responsibility to self-determine. God Almighty has given us a mandate and a charter here in this world. If you read the holy book, or many holy books, the garden was given to man and woman in the beginning. And so we know that we're the inheritors of this wonderful and beautiful earth. So looking at that, Versan, I think the major takeaway with that is to not be caught up in the idolatry, to not be caught up in the, oh, they're going to do it for me. We have the power. We are in control in many regards. We look at the digital podcasting landscape that's come up over the last 5 to 7 years here in the United States, and certainly in the Western and centralized worlds out there. We can see real-time evidence of the type of power that we wield. We defeated the mainstream media propaganda machine just recently here in the United States of America. The Western world population groups are increasingly more awake to a great deal of the corruption. I think there's still some distance to go with geopolitical understandings for certain, but with respect to their own internal corruption, a number of those groups inside of Western Europe and North America very, very awake now to what's going on. So I think looking forward, what we the people have to do is we have to understand that our education, our self-administration, our self-determination really of what happens in the world, it's our responsibility and it's up to us.
Words of wisdom. Amen. Well, if I could shift the conversation a little bit to China. China seems to be implementing central bank digital currencies already. They are aggressively rolling out. I hope that is just propaganda, because I actually have friends who came from China and they lived here in the States, and they would tell me that the US always lies about China. And then I listen to other experts out there, they're telling me that China is aggressively rolling out CBDCs domestically. Do you think this is a larger narrative to destabilize the US dollar's reserve currency, and at the same time even basically set the stage up for a war between the US and China? A final war, if you will.
I think you took the words right out of my mouth. It seems very much as a calculated endeavor to destroy the interconnectivity of the old economic system in the Asian space. And when you consider the enormous arms trade, the illegal arms trade that comes out of the East Asian continent, primarily through South Korea and Japan, but certainly transiting the Chinese mainland at points along the way, I think it's worth noting that a transformation of that economic landscape will inevitably lead to that same militarized conflict that we were talking about a moment ago. The Taiwanese island is sort of the linchpin, I think, in a lot of this discussion, even coming back to the Chinese domestic policy, because Taiwan and China for hundreds and hundreds of years have been essentially the same entity. They've been, it's sort of like being a Texan and also an American. You can be a Taiwanese and also a Chinaman. And I think that's exactly what we're going to see brought out into the world here. With respect to those CBDCs, I've heard those similar reports. It seems very much like Beijing is being set up, quite frankly, for a failure to start at the economic landscape when we look at the centralized component of that, because of the Taiwanese semiconductor industry tying back to Beijing and tying back to the US North American market. And we know that the North American market has to come down. So when that market eventually falls, when that DC Federal Reserve Hydra falls, every centralized form of economic exchange that ties back originally to that system will also fall. And for your audience out there, it's worth remembering that the Beijing landscape and the CIA landscape, or the Washington, D.C. landscape, are essentially the same landscape when we're talking about this very large-scale geopolitical shift. And all of that, of course, ties back to the BIS in Switzerland. So looking at that and seeing how that could be set up here to really yield a huge but brief militarized conflict in the Pacific that we've been expecting now for more than 2 years, I think it makes a great deal of sense when we look at how this could play out, and especially with respect, Versan, to the militarized deals and the fuel deals that China has with Middle Eastern countries like Saudi Arabia, like Iran, as well as the countries that are in the sub-Saharan African continent. And I hate to be a little bit redundant here as I wax on, but Russia really does come back in an important component in this as well, because Russia is essentially the big brother now for North Korea and Pyongyang. And Pyongyang and Beijing have not had the greatest relationship over the last 50 years. You could imagine how it feels to be under the thumb of your neighbor and have no way out. And so looking at that and Russia being able to support the activities, especially the military activities of North Korea on and around anything that happens from, coming out of Beijing and from China and China's activities, I think that's very, very important when we look at what China's doing economically.
My God, there's just so many moving pieces. And, war is not the answer. I was briefly sharing this with you before we got on. I'm from the Middle East, born and raised Saudi Arabia, grew up in Dubai. The last thing we need is war with the Middle East. And the truth is, in the Middle Eastern people, like 90% of what people see over there and hear about, like radical Islam, that's all manufactured. And that's not a joke. There was no such thing as Sunni and Shia when I was growing up, actually. People, they're good people out there. They never show you that. That is still going on. And that's what concerns me, even with Trump being president now. I've seen some things. Rudy Giuliani was speaking the other day at the Trump thing in Madison Square Garden, and he said that Islam hates us, and that's not true. So my question keeps coming back is like, to why are they trying to redirect our anger and hatred to the Middle East? Almost seems like they're trying to set up another 9/11 all over again. I'm being honest. Yeah, it's very strange.
It's very fascinating, Versan, that you should bring that point about, because President Trump has told the American population for over a year now that some sort of terrorist attack is imminent here in the United States. And we know that that's clearly a narrative seed. But again, when we look at the entities versus the people groups, they are distinctly different. Groups over there on the ground, which we've referenced both on and off air, primarily are extensions of the U.S. intelligence community, the Israeli intelligence community, and the U.S. State Department. You mix in a little bit of judiciary corruption there and some dual citizenry, and you've got really a recipe for a huge fortification, a huge locus of control being put essentially offshore of the Washington, D.C. government, and that's exactly what we've witnessed. We know here in the United States that a certain entity was primarily behind the attacks on 9/11/2001. We know that entity sent over tremendous amounts of agents masquerading as academicians and academic students to come over and basically hardwire our towers for destruction. We watched on that particular day as more than 3,000 people on this end perished in real time, and we were given a complete weaponized and false narrative on what was actually occurring there. It's very interesting that just in recent weeks and months, we saw reports coming out tying back individuals to the Saudi Arabian government, distinct from the Saudi Arabian people, also being involved and behind some of those planning and maneuvers. So in this period of time, Versan, if I may, I think we're symbolically reliving our recent history. And I'm cautiously optimistic that in so doing, we have the ability to set the record straight, and we have the ability to set the record right. The U.S. Army on 9/10/2001 published an advisory document recommending to the administration, the 43rd administration at the time, that it was the Mossad intelligence community that posed the greatest destabilizing geopolitical threat to emanate from the Middle or Near East regions, not because they were outright against we the people here in the United States, but because they were power-thirsty, bloodthirsty, power-hungry warlords that were willing to sacrifice any population group, including their own, which is something we witnessed just last year, beginning in October, with the complete failure, the epic failure, and I think what many people out there would correctly define as the planned failure of early warning and detection systems in that area of the world, clearly spawning off a conflict. That was a false flag if there ever was one. And I'm fully anticipating that we're going to see something like that again. However, I am also cautiously optimistic that with the saturation of the information space and the ability of all of us worldwide across these nation-state boundary lines to get the proper narrative out to the fore and amplify what is the truth to we the people, I'm cautiously optimistic that we can avoid the fallout that came as a result of 9/11/01 and actually address the serious and real problem, the sort of elephant in the room, if you will, which is foreign co-opting of all of our governments.
Yeah. And I really hope this information through X has allowed people to discern what is real and what isn't, and the ability to critically think for themselves instead of listening to what some of these people are saying and kind of like letting the headline almost set the mood for the reader before they actually do their research, because we see this in many cases. So I really hope that people can learn from all of this, because if they don't learn and they get baited again, we're in big trouble. We really are. So it's going to be very interesting.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
I could not agree more. And if I may, I want to sort of add a final note on that particular topic. It does come back to we the people having to learn. It comes back to we the people having to accept that the belief systems that we have and the perceptions of the world that were created for us by a lying, treasonous legacy media machine that has done nothing but create division for over 80 years All of that is our responsibility to change and to absorb the new world and to understand that there is a new way of doing things, that we are all primarily the same. We all want the ability to worship how we want to worship, to love our families how we want to love our families, and to get along with one another. We want the ability to have fairness in our transactions. If you have gold and I have oil, let's transact them fairly. Or if you have chickens and I have milk, let's transact those fairly. Outside of that, Versan, I think that we can have an infinite discussion on the variety in the social sphere that we would like to have inside our respective cultures and our communities. But fundamentally, we as humanity are created in the image and likeness of God, and we all desire at our core the same things.
Amen. Amen. Really. Well, what should the American people and everybody around the world, what should they be doing right now to safeguard their spirituality, their wealth, of course, personal freedoms? What should people be doing to take power away from them and give it back to the people? I've always said precious metals, because that takes control directly away from the central bank. And it's interesting because the central banks are actually buying up all the gold while manipulating the price still.
Well, you ask a very tall question. I'm not a spiritual or financial advisor, but I will say that, any amount of effort that people can put towards decentralizing themselves from the machine, in other words, taking back some amount of control, direction, and autonomy of their own lives, that is the name of what the Great Awakening is all about. If you're able to out there, I would caution people to invest a little bit in all of the things that you described a moment ago. Maybe dabble a little bit in the crypto space, get a few precious metals underneath your belt or some coins if you're able to. Here in the United States, I also tell people to purchase things like ammunition because of practicality. Understanding that, it is our attitude and our confidence that takes us away from that beast system first, and then our actions that emanate from that attitude and from that confidence. That, I think, is the spiritual side of the question you just asked a moment ago. We have to step back, quite literally, Versan, into our own power. We have to understand that we can affect real societal change, that we don't have to be slave to a system that was created for us, but not for our benefit, that was created by those that are essentially out there to rule the entirety of the world. And evaluating what they are doing, such as purchasing those very things that you mentioned a moment ago, I think that's all of the statement that we need, right? The enemy of my enemy is the same sort of example that I would utilize, or the same type of thinking that I would utilize in that concept. If they're doing it, perhaps I should as well, because they've known something, quite frankly, for a long time. Here in the United States, one of the things we also do, and that I encourage people to try and do, is to stockpile a few cans of food each time they go to the grocery store. They don't have to spend hundreds of dollars, emergency prepping for something that they don't know is going to happen yet. But a few dollars here and a few dollars there will eventually result in a comfortable pantry. The ability to be autonomous is the name of the game, and is, I think, the essence of what we're doing here. And that's what I would encourage people to do in any form and fashion that they're able to.
You and I think alike very much. And in fact, next time we bring you on, I hope we could do this again. I certainly want my brother to participate in the call. Well, we think identically. We really do. And after I've been listening to you for a year, I can totally agree with a lot of what you've said. So, final question. I think we've covered a lot of ground already in like 40 minutes. So let's talk about AI very briefly. There's a lot of hype around AI, and of course potentials and the revolutionizing of the industries and so forth, but there's also a lot of disruption with AI. It's actually replacing a lot of jobs, and it's going to continue to do so. There's going to be economic disruptions as well. Do you think we're heading towards a future where AI completely replaces a significant portion of the workforce and the population, really? Because this kind of ties into what the World Economic Forum has been pushing. If you've listened to Yuval Harari, I believe that's his name, saying humans are useless and we don't need them anymore, and we could just engineer them. Those are some very disturbing phrases by these people. And the public will say, no, that's conspiracy theory. But it's not really. So what do you think about AI?
Oh, Yuval is one of my favorite individuals to follow. The sheer arrogance on the man's face provides me entertainment, really, at this stage in the game. looking at the future of AI, technological capability, the quantum landscape, Versan, I think we have to acknowledge that AI is here to stay. AI is a data-driven intelligence. It's a creation of mankind, but it has the ability to machine learn in many regards and to process almost an unlimited number of inputs and stimuli. That can be something that is extraordinarily useful and can be very, very adept at improving the world if we're able to police it correctly. And I think that's the real discussion that we should have. It's not about the efficacy of the actual product, but how do we morally and ethically allow that product to help us improve the world without disrupting us or deposing us as the decision maker entirely. It is worth noting that with AI still requires power, and we have a system right now here in the world that is essentially a constrained power system. So we do have the ability in some regards in this, what I would call a beta test phase for the entirety of our civilization, to get it right before we're sort of irreversible in that mark. We know that 0-point energy, limitless electromagnetic harnessing is coming. We know that Tesla technology is going to make a reemergence into the world. So I think it sort of is poetic at a spiritual level that God would allow us this period of time to sort of get our feet wet and mess it up a few times, but still be able to pull the plug rather than connecting it to an unstoppable source of energy when it's not properly coded, properly adjudicated, and properly deployed out into the world. You're absolutely right that the economic disruptions that it's causing are going to continue to get bigger and more profound. I think you're going to see redefinition, quite frankly, of entire industries, especially those that are heavily reliant on computer processing power here in the coming years and decades in this wonderful earth that we have. But fundamentally, I think the discussion that we have to have, Versan, is how we're able to correctly code and then manage, in other words, to control even into the future at a point of limitless energy, the ability of AI to improve or disimprove the world that we have around us. It can be an incredible asset, an asset, quite frankly, the likes of which we've never had. One person can do the work of 100 with an appropriately coded and palatable AI assistant. But again, that AI assistant must be a reflection of the goodness of humanity, not an undesirable view.
Very interesting. When I was a young boy, I was very fascinated by 0-point energy. I started reading a book and I started studying gravitational propulsion systems and force fields and how this was all possible, but it was all buried to keep those in power. If I'm not mistaken, correct me if I'm wrong, but the Lockheed Martin CEO, before he passed, he said it would take an act of God for these technologies to emerge to benefit the population. So you actually believe there's going to be a major breakthrough in the mainstream for 0-point energy? Curious.
Yes, I do. And if I may expound upon that, I think the avenue by which that breakthrough will be introduced primarily to the Western world audience is going to be through U.S. congressional investigations. We already have a number of investigative committees that are talking about handling UAP phenomena and bringing that issue back to the table. This just being in the last few days post-Trump election. We also have stirrings out there in the online community from individuals that have been contacted by the Trump administration, such as Mr. Michael Salla on X, the author of the U.S. Air Force and U.S. Navy Secret Space Program books. And he has discussed how if he's tapped for advisory roles within the administration, that he will essentially lay it all out there about the exopolitics, the exotic propulsion systems, the neutrino detectors that exist beneath the ice shelf in Antarctica and others, because those are the next generation technologies or the very advanced technologies that have been in existence here in the world, helping those Luciferians to control the planet. If we have those then introduced to the public after we depose the Luciferian control structure, I think tying right back to our AI discussion, that will allow us to revamp and reimagine the really just the entirety of the landscape of this earth, from trade to commerce to government to politics to community and everything in between. And ultimately, Versan, I think we can achieve a world where there is no such thing as poverty and there is no such thing as hunger. I understand that that's a lofty goal that may be a few generations away, but I firmly believe that those wheels are in motion now.
Well, the thing is, if we, the people, actually took the power back, this could be done a lot faster. But that's going to take a long time, probably. So we'll see. I think technology has really made people lazy. But of course, I'm very optimistic. I'm very positive about some of the transformations out there. But unless we, the people, actually take control, like you said, things could go in a very different direction very fast. Also, one thing that I continuously talk about, I learned this from Dr. Pippa, who spoke at the 2022 World Government Summit in Dubai. And she was saying that if we're going to have digital money, if we're going to have all this digital infrastructure, there's going to be the need for the discussion of a digital constitution of human rights, because we already communicate digitally. So we need to protect ourselves digitally as well when it comes to finance, when it comes to freedom of speech. And this is something I haven't heard anybody talk about. I just find that to be very interesting. And they never invited her back.
You know, it's fascinating that you bring that up, because that's one of the topics that I'm studying for the upcoming audio file 84, the idea of a digital constitution, a protection of, a bill of prohibitions, basically, that prevents any government, not just here in our respective communities, but in any government worldwide in the course of international transactions, from abrogating or destroying or disappointing those rights and those protections. We absolutely have to have some form of international treaty or treatises that allow for security, that allow for the financial landscape build out, and also allow for the protection, much in the same way that the U.S. Bill of Rights was supposed to protect the original republic, allow for the protection of those individuals and those entities conducting transactional business in the information space. The information age is the way of the future. And if we don't blend our realities between the physical and the intangible, between the physical and the metaphysical, if we want to call it that, we're not going to fully blend, I think, and come out on the other side to a quantum capable Earth, and an Earth that's able to be returned more to that garden vantage point of the beginning, a much more balanced Earth with relationship to our Creator than we've ever had in days prior. And so, that particular topic, I find it very interesting that you should ask about that, because that is something that I saw the Trump administration talk about very briefly in 2020 and 2021, when we talked about the deplatforming of the sitting president in January of 2021. One of the statements that I believe Trump made privately was that we needed some form of digital protection, or some landscape that allowed for real teeth to be enforced when something like that actually occurs. Free speech means free speech, yes. Freedom of worship, freedom of worship. It doesn't matter if you're worshiping through the television or if you're worshiping in person. It doesn't matter if you're speaking through the television or if you're speaking in person, right? Or through a screen like this. The fundamental act, the actual nature of what's occurring there must be secured. And since we've witnessed a very clever, very bureaucratic, very sleight of hand system essentially disappoint and disempower a great deal of that Bill of Rights in the information age, I think we need to translate that Bill of Rights to a broader protection. And I'm imagining, Versan, that would have to come if we're going to form international treaties that countries can truly agree upon with respect to transactions, linking their banking systems, linking their ledgers, things like that. These are very intimate discussions to be had between nation states, and there would have to be guarantees.
Yeah. Well, this is why I'm always reiterating this part of a digital constitution, because I think the people need to have a say in something as well. Otherwise, we still sacrifice everything. We can't just allow entities and governments out there to set the stage for us. People have to have a say in these things, in these decisions. Otherwise, it's pretty much the same thing, unless, of course, some miracle happens. But anyways, you have a final thought on that?
I do, actually. And with respect to a digital constitution system or a digital Bill of Rights, I think it makes sense that it would need to be hosted on a blockchain decentralized system that is not beholden to any government. It has to be an extension directly from we the people right back to the source. We need to establish a closed loop from person to person and sideline to the greatest degree possible any amount of true authority, except in situations of abject criminal activity. And again, that's what I think a great deal of this is all about. When you talk about massive money laundering to terrorist organizations, that cannot be allowed on a system, and certainly cannot be protected through any type of Bill of Rights, even if the Bill of Rights provides prohibitions and protections for all other forms of transaction. And being able to define those specifically, I think, has to be an extension of the people as living souls, and not from a pulpit of government anywhere.
It's very interesting, because I keep trying to explain this on some of my sessions that, again, that's why the SEC went after Ripple, because I think it's really about protecting their corrupt debt-based Ponzi scheme. And the technology really changes everything. It kind of makes everything transparency. It kills all the friction. And that's what they're afraid of. They won't be able to do these nefarious things on a public open blockchain. So for finance, I think XRP really is the answer. And that's why nobody wants to talk about it.
And I find it very appropriate that we should see the landscape building out to be favorable to XRP and XRP style currencies that sort of provide similar functionality, but certainly not at the scale that XRP has managed to carve out to this point in time. And again, if we're going to host a decentralized system, it has to be P2P. It has to sideline governments. It has to go, both around and through simultaneously all of these systems and allow for, I think, a measure of security, Versan, that we've never had here in the world before, which is sort of the joyful part in a lot of ways of this great awakening, is all of us get to try and beta test and trial run a great deal of these things as we seek to establish a system that amplifies liberty, that amplifies the ability to choose things, but protects us from nefarious activities, both from one another and on behalf of government actors.
Incredible. Okay, well, SG, this has been such an insightful, incredibly eye-opening conversation. It's been an absolute pleasure to connect with you. And I hope you will come back on soon. Let's just wait for a few things to unfold. Final thoughts. Do you have any last message to the audience here? We have a lot of young and older critical thinkers on our show, very smart people. So please give them something positive, because I know a lot of people are distraught with just the financial situation as well. And I think people are confused. They really are.
Well, and to be perfectly honest, I empathize with that in many regards. I share some of that, even though I also share the hopefulness that we've gotten control of some areas of the world again. From 2016 onward, we were always fated to have some sort of atomic world event and some sort of Armageddon at the hands of HRC. And we managed to avert that, I think, to our great benefit here in the world. So what plays out from here on out must amplify God, must amplify the goodness of we the people. And we really have an enormous task ahead of us of rebuilding this world. When I sit in my meditative time and my prayerful time in the mornings, I always try to focus on what the Holy Spirit of the living God is trying to tell me in any moment. And I'm heartily encouraged in the sense that we have a great deal of power and control that we've never exercised before, that we've quite frankly never even knew that we've had. And as we go forward in this process, I think one of the things we're going to discover outside of taking back our geopolitical systems is the fact that we are interdimensional beings as well. And we have a very high place here in the food chain, if I can utilize the terminology, underneath the cosmos. We were made in the image and likeness. We were given regency of this world. Regency is something reserved for a royal or someone who's part of the royal family. And so looking at that worldwide, and I don't say that lightly, but looking at that worldwide, I think it stands to reason that if we the people come together in our image and in our likeness, in our truest form with one another, there is literally nothing that can stop us, regardless of who is on or not on our side.
We need to unite, and the only thing that can really unify us is compassion. I'm always trying to remind people that money is just a tool, so we don't kill each other over a piece of bread. And there are more important things going on. I'm serious. Yeah, that's the truth. There's not enough love in the world. And I think that's really what they're afraid of. That's why they have the divide and conquer strategies. But if we could all come together and really be compassionate and thoughtfulness of everybody, since we are multidimensional, luminous beings, if you will, spiritual beings. So thought is very powerful. Just thinking about good deeds, I think, goes a long way.
I think it absolutely does. And if I may close on that note, Versan, when we talk about our thought and our capability to experience our emotions and then take our emotions and our thoughts and apply action here in the world, is that not the process of creation itself? Are we not able to bring forth into the world the mind and heart of the living God in those moments where we have that blending of the Holy Spirit and we can divine very clearly what he wants for us? I think that that's absolutely true of us, and that's absolutely what they're most afraid of. And the sooner that all of us realize that it's all been a facade and that the game is completely over, and the sooner we realize the tiny microcosmic subsect of our society that managed to create those artificial divisions between us, I think from there it's completely game over for them and it's game on for us.
I love that, man. Thank you so much. Okay, so where can people find you if you'd like? And I'll add the links in the description, but just for the listeners.
Certainly. I can be found online in 4 places. I'm on rumble.com/user/QNewsPatriot. I'm not on Rumble by SGAnon. And I can be found in 3 other places on Truth Social at the handle real SGAnon with a red check mark. I can be found on Telegram now at the handle t.me/real QNewsPatriot. And I can be found on x.com at the handle TheQNewsPatriot with a blue check mark.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you very much, SG. It's a pleasure, and I hope to see you again soon or communicate with you again. I can't see you, but for good reason, I'm sure. And I thank our audience for participating in this conversation. Have a wonderful day.
God bless. I look forward to coming back.